The Battle of Tsushima, commonly known as the Sea of Japan naval battle in Japan and the Battle of Tsushima Strait, was a major naval battle fought between Russia and Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. It was naval history's only decisive sea battle fought by modern steel battleship fleets, and the first naval battle in which wireless telegraphy played a critically important role. It has been characterized as the dying echo of the old era. For the last time in the history of naval warfare, ships of the line of a beaten fleet surrendered on the high seas. It was fought on May 27–28, 1905 in the Tsushima Strait between Korea and southern Japan. In this battle, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo Higashiro destroyed two-thirds of the Russian fleet, under Admiral Zinoviev-Rozhestvansky, which had traveled over 18,000 nautical miles to reach the Far East. In London in 1906, Sir George Sydenham Clarke wrote, "The Battle of Tsushima is by far the greatest and the most important naval event since Trafalgar." Decades later, historian Edmund Morris agreed with this judgment. The destruction of the Russian Navy caused a bitter reaction from the Russian public, which induced a peace treaty in September 1905 without any further battles. Prior to the Russo-Japanese War, countries constructed their battleships with mixed batteries of mainly 152 mm, 203 mm, 254 mm and 305 mm guns, with the intent that these battleships fight on the battle line in a close-quarter, decisive fleet action. The Battle of Tsushima demonstrated that battleship speed and big guns with longer ranges were more advantageous in naval battles than mixed batteries of different sizes. The wireless telegraph had been invented during the last half of the 1890s, and by the turn of the century nearly all major navies were adopting this improved communications technology. Nonetheless, Tsushima would be the first major sea battle in which wireless played any role whatsoever. Alexander Stepanovich Popov of the Naval Warfare Institute had built and demonstrated a wireless telegraphy set in 1900, and equipment from the firm Telefunken in Germany was adopted by the Imperial Russian Navy. In Japan, Professor Shunkichi Kimura was commissioned into the Imperial Navy to develop their own wireless system, and this was in place in many Japanese warships before 1904. Although both sides had early wireless telegraphy, the Russians were using German sets and had difficulties in their use and maintenance, while the Japanese had the advantage of using their own equipment. Background: conflict in the Far East. On 8 February 1904, destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian Far East Fleet. Anchored in Port Arthur, 3 ships, 2 battleships and a cruiser, were damaged in the attack. The Russo-Japanese War had thus begun. Japan's first objective was to secure its lines of communication and supply to the Asian mainland, enabling it to conduct a ground war in Manchuria. To achieve this, it was necessary to neutralize Russian naval power in the Far East. At first, the Russian naval forces remained inactive and did not engage the Japanese, who staged unopposed landings in Korea. The Russians were revitalized by the arrival of Admiral Stepan Makarov and were able to achieve some degree of success against the Japanese. But on 13 April, Makarov's flagship, the battleship Petropavlovsk, struck a mine. Makarov was among the dead. His successes failed to challenge the Japanese Navy, and the Russians were effectively bottled up in their base at Port Arthur. By May, the Japanese had landed forces on the Liaodong Peninsula and in August began the siege of the naval station. On 9 August, Admiral Wilhelm Vicheft, commander of the 1st Pacific Squadron, was ordered to sortie his fleet to Vladivostok, link up with the squadron stationed there, and then engage the Imperial Japanese Navy in a decisive battle. Both squadrons of the Russian Pacific Fleet would ultimately become dispersed during the battles of the Yellow Sea on 10 August and the Ulsan on 14 August 1904. What remained of Russian naval power would eventually be sunk in Port Arthur. The 2nd Pacific Squadron, with the inactivity of the 1st Pacific Squadron after the death of Admiral Makarov and the tightening of the Japanese noose around Port Arthur, the Russians considered sending part of their Baltic fleet to the Far East. The plan was to relieve Port Arthur by sea, link up with the 1st Pacific Squadron, overwhelm the Imperial Japanese Navy, and then delay the Japanese advance into Manchuria until Russian reinforcements could arrive via the Trans-Siberian Railroad and overwhelm the Japanese land forces in Manchuria. As the situation in the Far East deteriorated, the Tsar agreed to the formation of the 2nd Pacific Squadron. It would consist of 5 divisions of the Baltic Fleet, including 11 of its 13 battleships. The squadron departed on 15 October 1904 under the command of Admiral Zinovi Rozhestvansky. The 2nd Pacific Squadron sailed through the North Sea. As there were rumors of Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea, several Russian ships fired upon British fishing trawlers off the Dogger Bank, causing the Royal Navy to shadow the Russian fleet until a diplomatic agreement was reached. Barred by Britain from using the Suez Canal, the Russians sailed around Africa, and by April and May 1905 had anchored at Camaran Bay in French Indochina. The voyage was long and arduous, and the morale of the crews plummeted. The Russians had been ordered to break the blockade of Port Arthur, but the city had already fallen on the 2nd of January. So the Russian port of Vladivostok became the objective. Tsushima Strait. The Russians could have sailed through any one of 3 possible straits to enter the Sea of Japan and reach Vladivostok, La Perouse, Tsugaru, and Tsushima. Admiral Rozhestvansky chose Tsushima in an effort to simplify his route. Admiral Togo, based at Busan, also believed Tsushima would be the preferred Russian course. The Tsushima Strait is the body of water eastward of the Tsushima Island group, located midway between the Japanese island of Kyushu and the Korean peninsula, the shortest and most direct route from Indochina. The other routes would have required the fleet to sail east around Japan. The Japanese Combined Fleet and the Russian 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons, sent from the Baltic Sea, would fight in the straits between Korea and Japan near the Tsushima Islands. Prelude. Because of the 18,000-mile journey, the Russian fleet was in relatively poor condition for battle. Apart from the 4 newest Borodino-class battleships, Admiral Nebogotov's 3rd Division consisted of older and poorly maintained warships. Overall, neither side had a significant maneuverability advantage. The long voyage, combined with the lack of opportunity for maintenance, meant the Russian ships were heavily fouled, significantly reducing their speed. The Japanese ships could sustain 15 knots, but the Russian fleet could reach just 14 knots, and then only in short bursts. Togo was able to use the superior maneuverability of his fleet to his advantage, crossing the T twice. Additionally, there were significant deficiencies in the Russian naval fleet's equipment and training. Russian naval tests with their torpedoes exposed major technological failings. Togo's greatest advantage was that of experience, being the only active admiral in any navy with combat experience aboard battleships. The long voyage by the Russian Baltic Fleet blue, Rozhestvansky Fleet yellow, Dobrodvorsky Unit red, Nebogotov Detachment, Korea and Tsushima Straits and Tsushima Islands. Map showing the routes of both fleets.